1913 in Atlanta was a difficult time, a violent time, and everything was up in the air. In some ways, it was much like the time we're living in today. The world was changing very rapidly from an agrarian to an industrial society, and here was this child laborer, Mary Phagan, working for pennies an hour at a big industrial concern on Forsyth Street in downtown Atlanta, where the Sam Nunn Federal Building is today. And she's found there after having been murdered on Confederate Memorial Day, symbolically the most important holiday of the old order, the disappearing order, the defeated South. And she's discovered in a factory that is symbolic of the new order, the industrial South, the South that is welcoming outside investment and immigrants from the North and all over the world, really. So the crime highlighted this clash that was underneath all of Atlanta society at that time. And it was a particularly hideous murder. She was badly beaten. It was a confusing murder because beside the body were two subliterate notes that seemed to point suspicion at a Black night watchman at the factory. And they were written as if Mary Phagan had composed them in her death throes, but the officers immediately knew that that just didn't track. So there was this great curious clue. They came to be known as the murder notes, and they would hang over the case for its entirety. And even today, I wish a linguist would do a study of just the couple hundred words in those notes, because they are fraught with clues to all kinds of things, not just the crime, but Black identity, because they were obviously written by a Black person. They were in Black English. And to add to this, there was a new racy newspaper in Atlanta, the Atlanta Georgian, which was published by William Randolph Hearst, and he had staffed it with guys he'd imported from New York and Chicago, and they were really hard news guys and had no qualms about amping things up and sensationalizing and playing up the worst and most salacious details. So this girl is killed in this factory, and that's already difficult and ugly. And then 2 days after the murder, the Monday after the murder, the Atlanta Georgian goes to town with this, with multiple extras, red headlines. And within 48 hours, Atlanta was on edge. Atlanta had never seen anything like this, and the entire city was concerned. Yes, the police immediately arrested Newt Lee. Newt Lee was in a terrible position. He was a Black man who had discovered a white girl's badly battered body in a factory. And the police as most Southern police forces at the time would have immediately arrested him. But he protested his innocence from the first. And in the murder notes, the notes, the reason I say they're so interesting, they explicitly point out that a long, tall, black Negro, that's the quote from the notes, did this down here in the basement of the factory. And Newt Lee was a long, tall, black, emphasizing his color, not just that he was African American, but that his pigmentation was particularly dark. But he told a straight story, and within 2 or 3 days, the police believed him and knew he had nothing to do with it. And almost immediately turned to Leo Frank. The police tried to phone him early in the morning after the body was discovered. This was 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and no one answered the phone. And the police immediately saw that as suspicious. In fact, there was only one phone in the Frank house. It was downstairs in the living room, and his bedroom was upstairs, so he may well not have seen the phone or heard the phone. But then the police went to his house to talk to him, and he was extremely agitated. He couldn't get his necktie on. He kept requesting a cup of coffee. Finally, he settled down enough for the police to take him to the morgue, where, again, he was confronted with a very disturbing sight. They showed him Mary Phagan's body, and there was a great deal of disagreement about whether he actually looked at the body or whether he recoiled in what the police perceived to be a guilty conscience. And so, to a couple of good old boy Atlanta police detectives in 1913, that level of agitation, that lack of, what Southerners would consider manliness at the time, was disconcerting. And then over a period of days, Frank made some contradictory statements. Newt Lee, the night watchman who discovered the body, had to punch a handheld device every half hour or hour to show that he'd made his rounds in the factory. And Frank looked at it with the police the morning the body was discovered and said, "Oh, Newt got all the punches right. He couldn't have had anything to do with this." A day or two later, Frank, upon re-examining the punch clock, said, "Oh, he missed several punches during the night," as if to suggest that, maybe Newt was off committing the crime or trying to hide the body. It just didn't sit right with the police. And so the police arrested Leo Frank and charged him with murder. And also, very importantly, Leo Frank would be a suspect even today. I keep talking about good old boy police, but even a sophisticated police department would have suspected him because he was the last person to admit having seen Mary Phagan alive. She had stopped at his office earlier on the day of the murder to pick up her wages. And in those days, you got your wages by going to the manager's office, and they wouldn't even give you a check. They'd hand you an envelope with the cash in it. So she was never again seen after Frank said he gave her wages. So he was the last person to have seen her. And for the police, who were scrambling because all of these forces I was telling you about were unleashed and the city wanted an answer, he was an obvious suspect. Initially, I don't think anti-Semitism was a big factor. I think it mattered more that Frank was a Yankee and he was an industrialist who employed child laborers. There were about 170 workers at the factory, most of them teenagers, and most of those teenagers girls. So that was a tinderbox. I mean, today we think, all children are born to be educated and have their day in the sunlight. In Atlanta in 1913, children were a tool of capitalism, and Frank was seen by many in Georgia as an exploiter of capital of these young kids. And Atlanta had a philo-Semitic, a lot of Atlanta's original Jewish population had fought for the Civil War. So the grandfathers and fathers who were around Atlanta, fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War, who were around Atlanta in 1913, were well regarded and were part of the establishment. But as the trial began, and as the inherent tensions of a wealthy Jewish outside industrialist who had an engineering degree from Cornell and was seen as an exploiter of these young women, as that was played against the fate of this poor girl who had gone to work in this factory in good faith and had gone because her parents were no longer able to support the family. They needed to send their children out to work. The inherent sense that this Jewish factory superintendent was exploiting this girl entered the case. And at the end of the case, the defense lawyer for Frank, Reuben Arnold, said, you know, Frank wouldn't have been charged if he wasn't a Jew. This would have all been over if he was not a Jew. And there's a welling up of anti-Semitism here. And after Frank was convicted, the rabbi of the temple, David Marks, got on a train and went to New York and met with some of the leading Jewish industrialists and newspaper publishers, Adolph Fox at the New York Times eventually, and said, we've had a terrible anti-Semitic prosecution. It's not even a prosecution, it's a persecution. And it was at that point that anti-Semitism really flared up. And Tom Watson, the agrarian rebel who published this newspaper, the Jeffersonian, out of Thompson, Georgia, if you can believe it, Thompson was a red hot spot of publishing in Georgia in 1913. He took up the case then. Tide of opinion never swayed in Leo Frank's favor, at least in the South. Outside opinion was all pro-Frank. But I'm glad you mentioned Jim Conley, because without addressing Jim Conley, we can't understand the true complexity of this case. Jim Conley was the janitor at the National Pencil Factory, and he signed some affidavits during the investigation saying that Leo Frank had enlisted his help when Frank was trying to seduce Mary Phagan. Leo Frank would give him some money to stand guard downstairs at the factory while Frank took Mary Phagan into the deep recesses of the factory and had an assignation with her. And according to Conley, the assignation turned violent and Frank killed her. And then Frank enlisted Conley's help to dispose of the body and then dictated those strange murder notes I mentioned to you to Conley to throw suspicion on another black man, because importantly, Jim Conley was light complected. He would be described always in the newspaper as coffee colored. And the all-white jury in the trial of Leo Frank accepted Jim Conley's word over Leo Frank's word. And this was a remarkable thing in the South. Maybe the first, you can't really say for certain, but one of the first, at least, instances in which an all-white jury sentences a white man to death on the word of a black key witness for the prosecution. And the South at that point, you know, race always trumped class in the South. One of the reasons there are no unions and very little class consciousness in the South is that the rich white and the poor white together could claim via their racist mathematics dominance over blacks. But in 1913, there was this bubbling up of an awareness among both poor blacks and poor whites that they were both being exploited by capitalists and factory owners. And so when a black man got on a witness stand and said that Leo Frank was exploiting him, was exploiting Mary Phagan, for a jury of white middle class, lower middle class jurors, that made sense, because suddenly they wondered, you know, who are these people coming down from the North with their fancy Ivy League degrees and their newfangled notions about assembly lines and, you know, doing work in accordance with scientific methods? Who are these people? And why are they exploiting us? So that's a very key thing to know. But it wasn't until months after Frank's conviction that this case became a national cause celeb. And that's when the New York Times took up cudgels for Leo Frank. The New York Times, edited by Adolph Fox, who had grown up in the South and got his start in publishing as the editor and founder of the Chattanooga Times, he thought he understood what had happened. And he felt that if he could just acquaint readers with facts that he believed exonerated Leo Frank, he would be able to prevail upon them and convince them that the wrong man had been convicted. Well, au contraire, the Southern press, particularly the Jeffersonian, edited by Tom Watson, disagreed with Ox's views, and Watson took it upon himself to rebut the New York Times every week in his weekly Jeffersonian, and not only rebut the New York Times, but to up the ante, to accuse Frank even more vociferously than he'd been accused in the trial. So things turned superheated, and we had a situation that is very much like that of today, where there were no agreed upon facts. There were false facts and false flags and opposing narratives, and you couldn't get a consensus on even what had happened. And the people of Georgia thought they knew what had happened. They thought, by and large, that this Jewish industrialist had killed this poor little girl. And the people of the North thought they knew what had happened, that this black janitor had killed her, and then very cleverly fobbed off the crime on Leo Frank and convinced a jury that that was so. Lynching of Leo Frank is really one of the most extraordinary things that has ever happened in Georgia. And I hasten to add there were 22 other lynchings in Georgia in 1915, but none of them required the daring do and the political juice this one did. Frank was abducted from the state prison, not from a county jail, the well-guarded state prison. And the lynch mob, and even the word mob is a misnomer, these were all pretty well-educated, capable people sent on their way by a group of the most powerful politicians in Cobb County and some from around the rest of Georgia, sent on their way down to Milledgeville, knowing that they could get in and abduct, by that point, the most famous prisoner in America and get away scot-free without a shot being fired. And the reason they were confident of that is that the lynch party planners had wired the prison. They had used political leverage run through the state legislature to make the warden and his staff beholden to them for their professional lives. If they turned their back and let the mob take Frank out, they could carry on their careers. And not only that, the state legislature was funding expansion of the state prison farm, and the money, sure enough, did flow after Frank was lynched. So the mob gets Frank without firing a shot, and then, as you say, takes him on this circuitous route. They took him on a ride, and they went far to the east of Atlanta. No one is exactly certain of the route, but by the time they were coming into Marietta, they were coming from the north, which would help support their alibi that they'd been on a fishing trip up in North Georgia. And, you know, Milledgeville, as the crow flies, is about 95 miles south of Atlanta and Marietta. But this lynch party drove much further than that night in order to confuse anyone who might have been onto them. They were very smart. They'd cut all the phone lines into Milledgeville except for one. So a call had gone out, and there were lawmen on the road looking for the lynch party, but they thought the lynch party would come through Atlanta, take the direct route back. But instead, the lynch party swung up north, at least into northern Gwinnett County, and maybe even up to Winder. And then they turned south and came back south into Marietta. So when they got to Marietta, they were coming on Roswell Street, and they hung Frank at Fry's Gin, which is memorialized by Fry's Gin Road today at the corner of Roswell and Fry's Gin. And there was a table there waiting to serve as a platform for the hanging, and the lynch party had a rope already tied into a noose in the car in which they were transporting Frank, and they put him on this platform and they lynched him. And then they all disappeared. And when I was working on my book, I talked to the sons and daughters of 6 of the planners, and I talked to kids who as teenagers had ridden their bicycles out there and had actually seen Frank's body hanging. And therein lies a tale, because one of these kids was the 17-year-old son of one of the lynch party planners. And a source of mine in Marietta kept saying to me, how did he know to go out there on his bike at 7 a.m? Why would he have gone out there? And my source said, it's because his dad told him, because his dad knew in advance. But they pulled this thing off, and then they disappeared into the woodwork. And eventually they did go up to North Georgia to a fish camp to try to establish an alibi. But by that point, the scene around the corpse of Leo Frank had turned into a grotesque festival of violence and revenge, and thousands of people gathered. One of the most violent of those people cut down Leo Frank's body, tried to desecrate the body, was going to destroy the corpse, and a judge, Newt Morris, who was portrayed as the hero of the moment, came and stood between Frank's body and the mob and said, "This man has parents. We're going to return his body to his family for a proper burial." And he prevailed and was portrayed in the newspapers as, a brave soul of reason in Atlanta. In fact, he was one of the planners of the lynching, but he had enough moral authority to talk the mob down. And it was just a grotesque scene, and it really wasn't over. They threw Morris and another guy threw Frank's body into the back of a car and drove it to the Chattahoochee River, where it was met by a motor hearse from a funeral home in Atlanta. And the hearse got the body, took it on into downtown Atlanta. Soon enough, crowds knew that Frank's body was there. They'd try to hide the body in the garage of the mortuary, but the crowd was threatening to break into the mortuary. So for the next several hours, hundreds, maybe thousands of gawkers filed by Leo Frank's casket, which was set on sawhorses in the funeral home. And finally that evening, the family got control of the casket, got it onto a northbound train to New York, and left to bury Frank in Queens in a couple of days. I'm 95% sure that Jim Conley killed Mary Phagan. He had the motive, which was not sex, which is what the prosecution contended, that Frank was taking sexual advantage of the young girls. His motive was robbery. He was drunk. He was broke. He was in the factory lobby the morning of the murder. He saw Mary Phagan come down the steps from Frank's office, having just picked up her pay, which was in cash, and he killed her. I don't know that he meant to kill her, but after he had robbed her, what could he do? He was going to have to kill her, or else she would have testified against him for his violent attack. And the reason I hold out a 5% brief against Frank is that during the trial and during the coroner's inquest, many young female workers at the factory testified in general to Frank's bad reputation, his reputation for lasciviousness. And under the rules of law, the prosecution couldn't ask for specific details of Frank's behavior. They would just say he was bad. He stood too close to me. He looked in the women's dressing room when we were only partially clothed. He made me nervous. He brushed up against me. And the defense did not cross-examine a single one of these young women. Now, again, according to the law, there was a reason to not cross-examine them, because had the defense cross-examined them, the young girls could have said, well, here are some specific instances. And so were these young women telling the truth about a boss who was a sexual predator, or were they all inflamed by, the almost in a Salem witch trial kind of way, by the insanity and emotion of the moment? And they imagined and assigned to Leo Frank these mysterious sexual urges and needs. We're never going to know that. We don't know the dynamic in the courtroom as they were testifying. I read every single Atlanta newspaper during the summer of 1913. So that was 3 newspapers for 90 days, a lot of newsprint. And I feel like I got very close to the tenor of the courtroom and what the atmosphere was. But, what was the relationship between Frank and these female workers? Had there been a pattern of abuse? We're just probably never going to know. And that's one of the reasons I think the case remains so fascinating, because I think the murder trials that we really remember, Jack the Ripper, the Lindbergh baby, we remember them not because they were solved. We remember them because there are some lingering doubts about them, because something in them continues to tug at us. And I also think we remember the Frank case because of what I said at the outset, which is that the South and the country were changing, and the agrarian order was ending, this industrial new age of mass transit and fast communication and fast cars and fast ways was taking over from the slow mule and farm economy that had been the norm in the South. Just as today, the internet and the information age are supplanting the industrial age. And there's a great deal of anxiety today that is, I think, would feel very familiar to anyone who lived through the Leo Frank trial.